Go ahead, Cheryl. We can all hear you.
Did you get a chance to read the articles? The one about the woman who had ended up killing herself. Then also, I sent and I asked Holly to make sure all of you guys got the issue of Christian Medical and Dental Association on physician suicide. Did you get that? And years ago, I did a talk on this. The Society for the Prevention of Suicide had a whole thing on. It's called Suffering in Silence, and talking about suicide among medical students, students of any kind, and residents, and also people who are graduate and have been in their own practice for a long time. So suicide is something that we don't talk about too much, but it's very prevalent. And I don't know if you looked at some of the statistics. They say in some ways physician suicides are as bad as suicides among war veterans, which I was quite shocked when I read that one. Do you talk about suicide in your classes or anything like that? Or
we have not in my school.
Okay. Now, I know some of you are medical students, some of you are other disciplines. My husband was very pleased to find out, because he's a dentist, there's a couple of pre-dental people. Is that true? I guess nobody will own up to it.
Yes. Yes.
But a lot of the pressures, no matter what kind of medical aspect of the medical culture you're in, there's a lot of pressure. And it ends up that there's certain pressures that are unique to the medical profession. And one reason I want to talk about it is that it's very important that all of you take care of not only your physical health, which is hard to do. I really appreciate that, because it was really hard to take care of my diabetes when I was a medical student. Especially, I was an oddity at the time. When I went to an interview, they said, "Why would we accept you? You're going to die when you're 40. So we don't want to waste our education on you." And I'm going, "Gee, thanks, I needed that." But it shows the kind of perspective people would come from. And I noticed a lot of students, no matter the discipline, have diabetes and you function with it very differently than I did. What do you think of the pressures in the medical community that would cause such a high rate of suicide? And
You have to be perfect and know all the answers, so there's no space for asking questions, or it feels like that sometimes.
Right? You just are supposed to accept it and just keep on. I think there's a lot of stoicism, and you're not the idea of a physician or a dentist, or what other occupations do we have in here? Nursing, occupational therapy or something. No matter what branch it is, you're not supposed to be vulnerable. It's like you're supposed to cut off the emotional part of yourself. And that's the worst thing you can do. Because if you're going to take care of yourself, because you're the tool for these patients, and you've got to make sure your physical self is good, your spiritual self is intact, and your emotional self. And that's the emotional part is often very, very neglected. You learn a lot of facts. There's a lot of pressure that I can't imagine all the things you have to learn now. It wasn't the same volume as when back in the 70s. And there's just so many facts that you have to know. And the other thing is that you're supposed to be perfect, correct? And who's perfect? And what effect does it have on the way you feel about yourself if there's this whole demand that you have to be perfect? problem is your image of yourself is always going to feel like a failure because it's attaining something that no one can attain. The only perfect person was Jesus. I think we can all agree about that. But what we're kind of told, or it's insinuated in the medical culture, is that we have to be perfect. We can't make mistakes. We have to do it right, and that kind of thing. And you don't feel that it's okay to talk to anybody if you're not feeling, if you don't feel that you're doing, that you feel depressed or you feel anxious or anything like that. No, you're not supposed to feel that way. Have any of you felt any of that pressure? Let's see a few nods. Especially think about it. How much we're in college, we're trying to get the perfect grades because we're trying to get into medical school or nursing school or dental school. And you push, and you try to be in high school. You try to be the top of your class so you can get into a good college. And then you work your butt off trying to make sure you get a good grades in college so you can get into medical school. And then while you're in medical school, you're trying to get on the top so you can get a good residency. And then all the pressures now on doctors. And I know I was free of it being in private practice, but making sure that you put everything. One of the highest things that people complained about was medical records. And the, what do they call it? The electronic record, how you have to do electronic record keeping. I don't know what you call it.
Yeah, electronic medical records, EMR, electronic medical records. Mm-hmm.
It doesn't
Yeah.
sound like fun.
It's still terrible. It's still like the number 2 thing,
Yeah.
secondary to the trauma of patient care. The number 2 thing is EMR.
Right.
Yeah.
And my impression is that doing EMRs is that you lose patient contact. You're so busy trying to keep up with the medical records. And I've experienced it as a patient, that you're sitting there and your doctor's glued to the tube over here trying to make sure they fill everything out. And you came into the medical profession because you want to treat patients. You wanted to have that involvement. So look at all the different stresses that are on you from the beginning. And and you neglect your physical health. Now, the person in the article of she was a Christian, she was in a Bible study. She was kind of, I would call, a little obsessive compulsive. She made sure she got 8 hours of sleep a night. No matter what, there was always, I could see some precursors that led her into having a hard time when the pandemic hit. And all this is because we want to control. We're trying to control everything. And during the pandemic and things like that, we don't have any sense of control. They just keep coming in and coming in. And all this stuff ends up, I call playing tricks on our minds. We come up with the wrong impression about ourselves and the world around us. And one of the hardest one ends up saying, I'm no good. I'm not a good enough physician. Other physicians are better than I. We put ourselves down. And part of that is because we're not honest with ourselves and what our feelings are. I had a quote from Christianity Today. It was a long time ago that said, just because you bury it doesn't mean it's dead. It can come back and bite you. And it's almost like if we keep stuffing things, it's like the proverbial closet. There's a point where all you're putting in there is a little ping pong ball, but everything falls out on top of you. You can't stuff everything forever. So, and how many of you really have an outlet to talk to somebody or to express some of the frustrations and the feelings that you go through when you're working or as you're studying? Anybody? Okay, just come on in. You have to have that outlet. You really do. And that's part of the hygiene, as they put it, that you have to do with yourself. If you don't take care of yourself, how can you take care of patients? If you don't take care of your physical self, how are you going to be able to have the stamina that you need to put in I know the hours are a little bit different than they were when I was an intern. I mean, I would be on call and not getting any sleep for 72 hours, kind of thing. It was like trial by fire. That's what it felt like. And I think I cried from June to January. January finally felt, okay, I might survive this. But it's, I think this culture of see one, do one, teach one. We went through it, you have to go through it. Are you seeing less of that than what I experienced? It was very much, I went through this, you have to go through it. This is how I became a doctor. This is the way you will become a doctor or nurse or whatever you're doing.
There's at least a cap now on the number of work hours they can work in a week. In theory, 80. It's capped at 80. So it's not a low cap, but it is capped at 80 hours. And they can't do more than 24 hours in a row anymore.
Really?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I remember one time twice in internship, I called my mom and said, "Hey, Mom, I just worked 40 hours in 2 days." And she said, "I know you're proud of that, honey, but don't ever tell me that again." Don't ever tell me that again, because I'm going to worry about you more.
Well, of course, for me, as having diabetes at the time it's 78 and 79 I was an intern. There's something that I didn't take into account, that the amount of stress that you're under will drive your blood sugar up like you wouldn't believe. And the bad hours, not being able to eat correctly and all that sort of thing. I think I walked around with blood sugars of 600 to 700 all the time. That's what I was accustomed to, and that's what I would have to think with and everything. And a lot of people thought I went into psychiatry because that was good because of my diabetes. But that wasn't the reason I went into it. In retrospect, it was the ideal profession for me to go into because I could accommodate my lifestyle much better to it. But the amount of pressure that you're under, it gets all that stuff going, and it does a number on your body. And if we're not in tune with that, if we don't have some of that hygiene into it, we end up with a lot of people killing themselves. Now I was looking into this, and there's about 10 myths that goes around about depression and suicide. One of them is that people say, you just want to be depressed. What do you think of that? I don't know if any of you have ever gone through depression. I don't think you want it consciously. You don't. It's a horrible feeling to go through. And then to go through it in silence and not sharing it with anybody. And depression does a thing on your mind. You end up again looking at yourself and forgetting your self-image as given, your image is given to you by God, and that you forget that. It clouds your perspective. It distorts your sense of reality about what's going on around you and what's going on within you. So we perceive ourselves the worst physician this side of the Mississippi, or the worst person, or whatever. We're unable to appreciate our achievements, our friendships. Everything is black. So who would want that? I don't think there is. And it's a horrible amount of pain. Depression is very, very painful. And unless you want pain, and if you like pain, you really should see someone like me, because you're not supposed to enjoy pain, okay? And there are people who have the diagnosis of a masochistic personality. Everything is in reverse. Their successes are their failures. And they're into pain a lot, that kind of stuff. But so if you've seen the commercials where the person's going around with this thing they put up in front of them trying to have a happy face, and walk around feeling depressed. Very, very much, a lot of us in the medical profession walk around and put on a happy face. Or we try to compensate by working too much. We work 100 hours a week. Or we feel we have to in order to try to make up for what we perceive as our deficits. The problem is that when we're depressed, it takes the evidence. They have false evidence, and it appears real to them. I often tell people your feelings aren't always your reality. They can be two different things. So, and the other myth is that we can get over depression by willpower. Pull yourself up by this bootstrap. You're not supposed to be depressed. What do you have to be depressed for? It's not logical. That's the worst thing you can tell somebody, because they can't will themselves to say, today I'm not depressed. It's not possible. So again, it ends up putting the person on a guilt trip. I see a difference between true guilt and false guilt. True guilt will get us to come to God and ask for his forgiveness and realize Christ died for our sins. The false guilt is where our judge and jury goes bananas, putting ourselves down, and Satan has a field day with that. Because when you're clouded, and then someone comes up to you and say, just stop being depressed. That makes you feel more guilty, doesn't it? So it ends up with, okay, it adds another thing to feel hopeless. Depression has a triad of hopelessness, worthlessness, and powerlessness. You feel stuck and it's never going to change. And you put up a face and that's one thing about people. Many times they're surprised when we find out someone has killed themselves. Most of the time, about 9 times out of 10, there are signals. There's something that lets you know that they want to kill themselves. And we can miss it. But some of the ones I get most worried about is someone who comes out of a depression feeling wonderful. They have no guilt, no nothing. But the problem is they've made a plan and they decided to go ahead with it. And next thing you know, like this person in this article in the Times, she goes out and kills herself. And everybody's shocked and surprised. You want the patient to feel anxious. If they feel anxious, there's a conflict. They want to kill themselves, but they don't want to kill themselves. In many ways, that kind of anxiety is good because it gives an opportunity to talk to that person and help them. But if you lay onto them a guilt trip that will just, stop being depressed, that's stupid. And can you see people doing that? Or maybe you received that yourself. What reason do you have to be depressed? You've got everything. Yeah, right. And then this is my favorite, one of my favorites, working with Christian, is unconfessed sin. You're depressed because you haven't confessed all your sins. What do you think about that one? The problem with something like that, again. Okay, go ahead. Who was talking?
Sorry about that.
Over there, okay.
I was just going to say, I think that it's a common feature of the church in today's era to not really pay much attention to mental illness and kind of attribute it to like demonic or sinful forces, and it kind of just glosses over and buries a problem. So.
Yeah. The thing is that most people are scared to death to look inside themselves. I think of I don't quote scripture well, so you can correct me. I think it's Psalm 139 that says, "Search me, God, and see if there's any hurtful way about myself." You know, is it in the right psalm? I'll assume it is. We often think it's because, again, we have unconfessed sin. God's going to help us to make sure we bring all our sin out. On one hand, that's true, but there's another time where we're sinned against. And all those hurts we keep inside. And they don't go away. Just because we can't think of them and they're not on the top of our heads, doesn't mean they disappeared and they're resolved. We have wounds inside of ourselves. That isn't unconfessed sin. It's the idea we need to acknowledge that we have some wounds inside. We have some hurts inside. Some are, if you've been raped or if you've been the result of any kind of traumatic event, that is not because you have sinned. You're hurting. And we as physicians, with ourselves and with other people, need to show compassion that they can hurt. And they can pray till the cows come home and try to confess every sin they can think of. It isn't going to go away. They need to ask for the healing part of God to help them heal the wound. One thing is realize you and your patients are like icebergs. There's this part above the water, but think of how much is underneath the water. And if we don't pay attention to that, we're going to run into it like the Titanic and sink. And God wants to help us with those wounds. If it's unconscious, how can we pray about it? How can we bring it to God to help, for his compassion and to help us? And if you read Paul in 2 Corinthians, even he went through a time of despairing of life. So feeling that sense of, forget it. It isn't that uncommon. But it's worse if we're taught, like in the church, we're not supposed to be depressed. It's something that we want, or it's because we haven't confessed our sin, or we haven't prayed enough. Does it disservice? Do you see how much guilt it puts on a person? We feel guilt. That person feels guilty enough. And it's well-intentioned. I don't think anybody in the church is saying, I'm going to go out and hurt somebody today. I think it's well-intentioned, but it's misguided. And my practice was 90% Christian. The people who were suffering and needed to talk about different things. Then another myth is that it's just self-pity. That's not true, is it? Yes, there's some people who can get, I tell people, because I know what it's like to deal with a chronic illness. And I say, yes, you can have a day where you have your pity party. You feel sorry for yourself. You're angry with the world, whatever. But just leave it. You do it for a day and then you move on. You get it out of your system. You talk about it with God. He knows our frame. He knows it's but dust. But again, if you go and tell that person it's self-pity, look at all the guilt you're putting on that person. This person that was in the article, her friends tried to get her help. So they were open and they weren't giving her some of this feedback, I imagine. But the hard part, to build up enough trust to be able to think, I can talk to anybody of how bad I feel. That is very, very hard, to feel vulnerable. And we're in a profession we're not supposed to be vulnerable. I often tell people, MD doesn't mean mini deity. That people can look up at you in a certain kind of way, that you can't have weaknesses, you can't have vulnerabilities, but you do. You're a person. And even Spurgeon struggled with depression. There's a lot of different people that have dealt with depression. Oops. Sorry. And this is a corollary in a certain sense. Our faith isn't strong enough. Now, having diabetes, one time I was married and my husband and I were with this group of Christians. I can't remember what we were doing, but I remember one person coming up to Dennis and I, and its earnestness said, "Have you prayed about it?" And I'm going, "Gee, I never thought about that. I'll have to go right immediately and pray about this." I prayed about it constantly. Prayer doesn't make it disappear. I still had diabetes. I still needed his help to know how to deal with it. And I needed to know how to help with my emotions about it. And depression isn't just because your faith isn't strong enough. And we need to understand that when we're dealing with ourselves and with other Christians. Because this person in the article, they talked about a Bible study. And Holly, you told me that you knew somebody who was in her group. She was a Christian and she killed herself. Christians aren't immune from the problem of suicide. That's why mental health hygiene is very, very important for you. And but the problem is depression plays tricks on our mind. And it gets us to think that the only way out is by killing ourselves. And one of the things I often get is, well, if I kill myself, everybody will be better off. Have you heard that one? But it's not true, is it? Look how it distorts your way of thinking and how you perceive things. I have read and dealt with people who are survivors of suicide. Their parent killed themselves or a close friend killed themselves. It isn't something you get over easily. There's questions, it hurts. And I'm sure the friends of this woman in this article have struggled very deeply about this. So, but the thing is that all of you need to remember that with yourselves, and this is why it's important to talk to other people too, or if you're working with someone else, don't assume they're going to be rational and that they're going to be logical. How many times have you tried to talk to somebody and logically talk them out of something, like a depression or suicide? It doesn't work. There's other ways of approaching it. You can't be logical if they're being illogical. You can't be rational with someone if they're being irrational. And we get very frustrated and we can get angry with somebody because we're working very hard to try to help them. And what do? They push us away. But I often do it like this. I don't know if you can see it. The hand goes out and they're doing this at the same time. They're a little bit, come closer, but stay away, come close, but stay away. It gives a double message. So these are the different things that you're going to run into. And you yourself may find yourself thinking some of these things. And we're not immune from it. And the stresses that we go through in medicine with lack of sleep, even if it's 8 hours a week, that's not normal, is it? Most people are supposed to work, we have the 40-hour work week. I know most of the time it's 50 or 60, but we're supposed to have the 40-hour work week. 80 hours is supposed to be more of a humane, I guess. Is that what they call it, Laura?
Decreases error. That's the way they have justified it. That it balances. That having physicians that only work 80 hours a week means that their error rate is overall lower, and therefore it justifies the cost of having lower malpractice claims and costs.
Oh, really?
So it's all a cost-benefit analysis and the bottom line, Mm-hmm.
The problem with that, it doesn't make us human, does it? We're statistics. Medical training can be very dehumanizing. I don't know if others have experienced that. but especially with all the pressure that you put on yourself to get good grades. And we buy into this idea, we got to get into the best medical schools, we got to get into the best residencies, you know, that kind of thing, in order to, we're very achievement oriented. She was very achievement oriented. I don't know how she did everything that she did. She had more degrees than alphabet soup. But think about it. We need a touch of OCD to survive, to be organized, you know, a certain thing like that. But it's, and now with the pandemic, that's another kind of pressure that we're under. And in what way do you, can you, I know you guys are not in the emergency rooms and all that sort of thing right now, but what kind of pressure does the pandemic put on people? Any ideas?
It puts more pressure. I would think, you know, with the rate of how people are getting sick and people are dying, that you would definitely feel the weight of patients dying one after another. I think in New York and in some places they were saying like more than one physician had to sign off on a death because the death of that patient felt like that was on that one physician to constantly make that call.
Mm-hmm.
The pressure of trying to save as many lives as you can, the pressure of things not feeling like they're out of control when you don't have proper staffing, proper equipment, proper space, not knowing if, you know, what the next day is going to look like, but trying to be in control of your workspace, your environment, your people that are working with you. It's a lot to try to be in control of emotionally, mentally, physically, and trying to be in control of that and having no control in it day by day. So.
But you bring up a very important point, is the word control. That is something that we have to look within ourselves too, because we often have control as the most important thing in our lives. We have to control our environment. We have to control ourselves. We have to control this. We have to control that. I think one reason this woman, what was her, Dr. Beam, got into problems is that her life was control. Everything was under control. But the pandemic, she could not control it. It was, you know, so many people coming in that were sick. We didn't understand that. We understand more about the virus now than we did at the beginning, but not enough yet. Kind of stuff. She was not in control, which is one of the basic parts of where depression and suicide come from. And in a way, suicide is the ultimate control. Can you imagine being in that category?
Yes. Yeah, I can. It's a feeling like, okay, I'm finally doing something. It's finally putting an end to what's going on. So that's a surefire way, if you will.
Yeah, it's like we eventually convince ourselves that this is the only way to be able to control everything. And we delude ourselves into thinking people are better off without it. People don't need us in doing medicine or anything like that. And the other reason many physicians do it is because they feel shame, because we're not supposed to be vulnerable. And the other thing is that we're afraid it's going to affect our licenses. We're afraid it's going to affect our staff positions. We're afraid of all these different things that are upon us. In the work that I did on depression years ago, one man, he was a surgeon. He was high up in his hospital practice and was doing a lot of committees and everything. But he knew there was something inside. To me, some people are self-confessed sinners. They know there's not something quite right when they come in because they want to talk about it. And to be able to, they know something is bugging them. So he decided it's time that he went and talked to somebody. All of a sudden, they let him off the committees. They decreased his surgical schedule, all these things because of his actually going for help. And he wasn't psychotic. He wasn't a danger to himself or anything. He just wanted to fix what hurt inside. But a lot of people in the medical professions don't do it because of these external pressures. It's not cost benefit, or sometimes taking the time off to deal with some of this stuff. I remember when I applied for a New Jersey license, because I was toying with the idea, did I want to work in Jersey, did I want to work in Philadelphia? You know that whole thing when you're young and stupid. But I was in psychoanalytic training, and on the application it says, have you ever had mental health, seen a therapist? Well, part of training is you have to see a therapist. You have to go through your own analysis as part of the training. So I said yes. I got called into the board of medical examiners because being honest with that caused them to have fears and concerns about my application. And a lot of physicians or students or things like they think that if they talk to anybody about this, it will affect their position in school, or they affect their licenses or their malpractice or all these sorts of things. And I know one person has been trying to work with the medical board just so that to take into account that there's some people it's helpful to go for some treatment. It isn't the end of the world. But they treated me as if I was going to not take my insulin anymore. I think they wanted to make sure I didn't talk to myself, that I wasn't psychotic, and I was very deadpan and direct about everything. But I can appreciate the pressure that there is within the medical community to ignore your emotional health. Have any of you experienced that at all already in your work, in school or anything?
Yeah, we're not. It's just I work in EMS, so there's an interesting way how we handle it. There is more of a push now for fire, police, and EMS personnel to get together, especially after a critical incident, and do a debrief and do a review, because I've noticed the rise of fire, police, and EMS suicides and other home issues are on the rise. But it's like we were saying, like in the beginning, like it's pretty much still that way. Like you don't talk about anything, you suck it up, buttercup, and keep marching. But then one of the ways that we do deal with it is through dark humor. Yeah. And I've been looking at that over time, and I join in on it, and I have my own dark humor and dark sense of way of dealing with things, and it grows a part of that culture. But then sometimes you notice when your partner or even you or somebody else keeps repeating certain things or keep laughing about certain things that probably shouldn't be laughed at. I mean, in a normal context anyway. So I've been trying to be more keen on listening on certain things that are being discussed in a light manner or even joked about, because that I feel like dark humor is being used as a way to vent, but not a way to actually deal with the problem, and things are going unseen, untreated. And then, like you're saying, someone's going home and pulling the trigger or doing something else. And I think dark humor is just being used as like a smoke screen just to kind of cope. And people will admit that, oh, this is how we cope and this is how we deal with things. And it's not mentally healthy wise. So, yeah, there's been improvements, but it's either you don't talk about it or you joke about it. Yeah. And that's normal. But to talk about it, sit down, that's not really normal, because it's what we're signed up for, so to speak.
Because we're afraid that if we get in touch with how we feel, that we'll become basket cases. We're afraid of our own emotions. Fear did not enter this world until Adam and Eve fell. They weren't afraid of anything. But when they fell, fear entered the world. And there's a lot of fear that we live with. If you look at yourself and think about the things that you're afraid of. And one of the biggest things I know for myself was thinking, well, if I got into that deep part of myself, I would become non-functional. But part of it was I didn't want to deal with pain. I didn't want to deal with the enormity of the various issues. But this is where, if you're in therapy, you're working alongside someone to help you navigate those awful dark waters. But look how we do mental health now. I always got frustrated with insurances. They would give me, even if you were psychotic, they would give me 5 visits. Yeah, right. How is 5 visits going to help me? Many times I had to probably beg the insurance companies for the medication I wanted to use. And they didn't want to pay for it. Everything's cost effectiveness. I think CBT and some other types of EMDR and other kinds of therapy are popular because it's short. But remember, again, I'm dating myself, so please forgive me. I don't know if you remember a commercial by Orson Welles. There was kind of a big, stout guy saying, unwind. We call no wine before it's time. And that's the way with working with somebody. I worked with some people, 2 to 5 years before we got to the other side. First of all, building up trust. Secondly, getting into those deep, dark things that they didn't want to talk about. They would kind of tip their toe in the water to see if there isn't any piranhas. And then the third stage of therapy is taking the risk to change. You know how risky that is? It's a risk for any of you to say, I'm going to look and see what it is inside of me that is not true, or believing falsehoods about myself. And what am I afraid of? That, here we are, we're supposed to be doctors, or we're nurses, or we're this or that. We're not supposed to be afraid. Is that true?
That's the expectation that, yeah, we're not supposed to be.
I can't see who's talking. I'm sorry.
Oh, Laura.
Oh, okay, Laura, you've disappeared. Oh, there you are. You're
Yeah.
now.
I know.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm back.
You were saying?
Yeah, I think it's the expectation that we're not supposed to admit to any fear. How about that?
Mm-hmm. The problem when we feel that we can't admit to it is that anybody who's courageous, it isn't the absence of fear.
Mm-hmm.
It's we do it anyway, even with our fears that are with us. And fears can hurt us only if we end up giving them the validity of as if they're absolutely true. And many fears aren't. FEAR stands for false evidence appearing real. False evidence appearing real. And it ends up paralyzing us from being able to do things. But we're in the medical profession and we need to be human. It doesn't mean we go up to and cry on everybody's shoulder. I'm not talking about that. But if you want to feel compassion for other people, compassion for your fellow colleagues and students and everything, you need to be able not to be afraid of your own inner feelings, because whatever you're afraid of inside yourself, you'll be afraid of helping that person beside you with their emotion. When I first was a resident, I was having a hard time with my own anger. I was brought up in a household, you're not supposed to be angry. You stuff it. So I didn't know how to handle anger. And eventually, I worked with somebody I grew up in an alcoholic home, so that kind of, it distorted my life like you wouldn't believe. I had to work through these things. And it was amazing once I was able to understand why I was afraid of anger and learn how to deal with my anger, how many patients I had anger issues. I was able to help them because I got to term with my fears and concerns about anger. So in many ways, doing this mental hygiene along with physical, watching your physical health and your spiritual health. I can't do it. I wish I had a chalkboard. remember the old Venn diagrams? I see man as 3 circles: their physical self, their emotional self, and their spiritual self. They all intertwine with each other. If we hurt emotionally, it's going to affect us physically and spiritually. If we hurt physically, it's going to affect our physical and emotional health. It's all intertwined. And if we neglect any part of that, it's to our detriment. And it takes away from our effectiveness in what we want to do as physicians or nurses, or and a lot of it has to do, we're afraid of losing control. And that is one of the highest motivations of a lot of people, is they don't want to lose control. That's why some people said, I don't want to cry. If I start crying, I'll never stop. Is that true? The feeling feels very true, but the reality, do we go through life and everybody's crying? No. It does have a beginning and it does have an end. And the other thing, many times people assume that if you're depressed, it's just because you're grieving. Depression can be a part of grief, but there's a whole complex around grief. And there's a lot of things in our work that we need to be able to grieve, because we're going to confront a lot of losses. And it is really hard not to be able to keep a person from dying. That's the whole point of medicine. So we're supposed to keep people healthy. We're supposed to keep them from dying. But we can't. We really can't do that, because there's responsibilities that the patient has. And there's, people are going to die. In my profession, suicide is a big risk. I lost a few patients to suicide. And it's hard, but it's trying to keep the perspective that they made the decision, not you. And you've done everything that you can. And it's hard working with people who have schizophrenia. It's hard working with people with bipolar disorder. They're sort of the chronic illnesses of psychiatric medicine. And the other thing is, we can't, just like we can't do cost effectiveness with people. We're people that run the hospital. We're not little pegs that are supposed to, fit in different holes. Is that we need to be able to appreciate that. The complexity. Try again. Complexity. I try to get my teeth in right. How complex God has created us. And emotions aren't sinful in and of themselves. We need to acknowledge them so we can pray about them. We need to acknowledge them for our own mental health, and being able to be open to other people and to be more compassionate healers. So part of taking care of yourself is in order to enable yourself to be the healer that you want to be. But often we're afraid. We're afraid if we do that, we won't be in control. We won't be able to help anybody, because we'll be some basket case in the corner. So see how we're believing lies? And Satan's a big deceiver, isn't he? And all these myths about suicide and certain pressures within the Christian community on top of the medical community. And we end up feeling we have to be perfect. And we can't be perfect. It takes away our humanity if we try to be perfect. Now, let's see, what time is it? Oops, 9:30.
Yeah. You also have, you have one question in the chat box. In your opinion, this is from Jerry. In your opinion, how has the prevalence of suicide within your experience changed as you practiced? And what do you think has contributed to that change?
I'm sorry, I don't understand. Can you state the question again?
Yeah. In your opinion, how has the prevalence of suicide within your experience changed as you've practiced? And what do you think has contributed to that change?
Well, within my practice as a psychiatrist, there's a certain amount of suicide risk that you you deal with every day, depending on if you have people with different kinds of major affective disorder and depressions and certain personality disorders. There's a high risk of it, and you live with that every day. But you have to. One thing I had to work on was being able to realize the other person is working with me. We're a team. But one thing I've noticed, apart from my own, psychiatry, you're going to have high risk of suicide. It's just part of the beast. But I've noticed a high risk of suicide in seeing any of the medical students and the residents, and how difficult it is for them to get help. I know when I was a medical student, it was really hard to get help, and it just seems like there's no change in that. The medical community isn't open to that. That is my perception. I'm not in the middle of medical school and residency, but I have a sense that hasn't changed that much. There's more pressure. And this is, there's one woman, I do Facebook mainly because I'm in the house all day and I like the recipes and I like the jokes a lot. But one person was sharing, and she had been an SMI person as well, but she was feeling guilty that she couldn't be in the front lines of the pandemic as all her friends were and working, and her husband. But the woman had a 1.5, 2-year-old baby. When you have a child, that becomes the focus of all your attention. A lot of people end up in my office because they have not had a quality involvement with their parents, kind of thing. And she had to deal with her sense of false guilt. I mean, those years with the child, like Woody, right? And how old is that's your child, isn't it? Anyway, those are precious years. Those are, and you don't get those back. And those are years that are very important in the psychological development. So I told her, what are you feeling guilty about? God has called you into a different line of service. He isn't calling you to be in the front lines of the pandemic. But I can see where that creates an overall sense of guilt, false guilt. Christ didn't die for false guilt. And it's from that false guilt that we often get this suicidal kind of feeling. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, a little bit. I was more so.
Oh, there you are.
Yeah, let me turn this thing on. Okay, I was more so asking about more so like how like prevalence, how often you're seeing suicide or suicidal ideations like within your practice. How has that changed, the prevalence of it? From within your own practice, like from when you started, are you seeing an increase? Does it seem like you were seeing more later on compared to the beginning? And if there is some sort of change or trend, what do you attribute to it?
I really don't see much difference per se, because by the nature of the profession, I am going to get a high risk. I have a high risk population. Bipolar has a high risk of successful suicides. There's a high risk of suicide in schizophrenia because of the kind of thought disorder they can get into. And if you have a lot of people with major affective disorder, be it Axis 1 or Axis 2, I know they changed the diagnostic, and that I don't know how to do that one anymore. You're going to have to deal with that. And some people, borderline patients, are huge on that, lower functioning character disorders. So, but I did notice a change in the kind of family orientation has changed over the years. There were stronger families when I first started practice in '82 than what I was seeing around the time I retired. I was in practice about 30 years. So there wasn't that much of a bond in the building up. It's from our parents that we learned that we're worth something. And if we don't have that, we go around trying to find it from other people or from our professions, and it doesn't fill that void. and it interferes with being able to realize what God has created in you. But the dissolution of the family is what I noticed was changing, so that the tenuous connection and the thought of suicide was more prevalent in that regards. But I dealt with it every day in one form or the other. Is that
Thank you.
Cheryl?
Thank you. Sorry. I have one more question, but I think was someone gonna ask a question? If someone was, that's okay. I'll take up the whole thing.
I just had one quick question, if I may. Okay. And I might be getting into your trade secrets, but I remember earlier you had mentioned when talking to people, not being logical when they're illogical, rational when they're irrational, and you approach that in a different way. Could you maybe one or two examples or a trade secret or two, if you would?
There's no trade secret, because all of you are going to deal with it. Because when you're dealing with a person, like even a person with diabetes, to you as a treating physician, it's logical that you follow your blood sugars. You count. My day, we didn't count carbs. I was 1,800 calories, and you did it. It's a kind of very regimented, and it's hard. And it's totally illogical that they deny that they have diabetes, or they do things that are against what they need, or the person with hypertension or cardiac, they don't do what is logical and what they need to do to help themselves. So you're going to run into it. And you can stand on your head and spit gold coins. It isn't necessary that they're going to take it in and do what you're asking them. So sometimes it's trying to keep that in mind and not, what's the word in mind? Be pejorative with them. Because some people don't go to the doctor because they feel the doctor will only yell at them. But it's trying to say, I know this is very difficult. You probably don't think I understand what you're going through, but I think we both know we need to work together to get this under control. You have to, listening, that's another whole lecture I can do, because listening is an art form that we have, that is gone out. Nobody does it anymore. And some people come in and say, gee, doctor, nobody's ever listened to me like this before. If there's an art to listening, and you need to do that with your patients and in depression, because by going ahead and saying, well, that's not logical. People are going to miss you if you kill yourself. What's going to happen is like you're up against a wall. They're going to be very defended. They're not going to listen to you. You have to find a backdoor way of getting into it. Now, sometimes when I had a patient who practically had 1 foot off Benjamin Franklin Bridge, that's when I had to go ahead and try to get commitments, because they weren't going to listen to me. And it's recognized, you have to be able to recognize it. No matter how good your intentions are, that person is not going to listen to you. So that's when I had to go ahead and try to do a commitment or a forced treatment. But you're going to run into it no matter what branch of medicine you go into, because people are not going to do, just because you told them to, doesn't mean they're going to do it. Have you run into that? I bet you have, Laura.
Yeah, a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's so logical to us, isn't it?
Huh?
It's so logical to us.
Yeah.
If you want to feel better, you do A, B, C, D, and E. But they don't do it.
Yeah.
Then they come back to you. Gee,
Yeah.
I feel miserable. I told you 1 billion times you could do A, B, C, D, or E. But it's trying to fight that impulse to be angry with them and to chastise it. That's what I want, to chastise them. And what they do is then they drop out of treatment because they don't want to be, they feel bad enough about themselves that they can't control it. And they haven't accepted it without going to the doctor and being told what an idiot they are. Is that clearer?
Yes, thank you.
Alexandra had one last question, and we do need to finish up quickly because we do need to go. We have a talk at Esperanza at 10:30. But what are some characteristics of negative internal thoughts that make them pathological as opposed to normal?
Boy, that's a whole lecture in and of itself. The kind of psychiatry I did was insight-oriented psychiatry. Now, some aspects of psychotherapy do not recognize the unconscious. To me, each one of us have a deeper part of ourselves. And sometimes, in order to protect ourselves, we get very defensive and we hold on to, I call them porcupine teddy bears. It doesn't do any good, but they hold on to it no matter how much it sticks them. And that's when something comes, that thought process can become more pathological. You know, sometimes we need a little bit of denial to cross the street, but if it ends up like Queen Victoria, wearing black all the time and insisting that they pour water for her husband every day so he could shave, that's pathological. She's holding on to something she won't let go. Now, some people with thought disorders, like schizophrenia or something like that, you have to approach them in a little different way. They're not going to be logical because their thought processes don't let you. But if someone's in the throes of a deep depression, they're going to hold on to these things very hard. And have you ever tried to take a teddy bear away from a kid? They don't give it to you, do they? They hold on real tight. It's like Linus and Peanuts. He doesn't want to give up his blanket. To them, these ways of thinking in the deeper part of themselves are their security blanket. And even though it doesn't do them any good, they believe, their thought process believe that's going to protect them from the world. That it's going to protect them from what's inside themselves. So I advocate very much that we need to appreciate, and this is where listening comes in, that's a deeper part of a person where they're working very hard not to feel or not to confront, and they're going to take a very defensive position. Now, that's my orientation. That's why I went into psychoanalysis, because I think the inner part of ourselves is something we're all very afraid to deal with. And it can end up, we kill ourselves. You're chuckling. What are you chuckling about, Jerry?
No, I'm because I really want to ask a question, but I know we're out of time. And I was gonna ask Holly. I really, it's just a really good question. I don't know if I can.
Okay, so I am going to be late at this point if I don't leave now. So, why don't let me just give an announcement. I do need to go. Anyone who's not going to be late and wants to stay a little to ask questions, that's fine. But I do need to go. So, all of you do know that we'll start Foundations a little bit late to give us a little extra time. I think starting like 10 minutes late is okay, and I'll text David and let him know. But we do need to be there. It's going to be, and I just want to thank Cheryl. So I'm going to sign out. But everyone else who wants to listen to Jerry's question, welcome to stay on. And Cheryl, thank you so much for taking the time all these years to speak to us. You've done such a great job, and I know this is a topic that's really important to the students.
Well, I enjoyed doing it.
Okay, thank you
for the opportunity.
Okay. All right, I'm signing off. But you guys, you can stay on.
We'll
Thanks. But be on time. Don't be too late.
Okay, we'll do one last question, okay?
All right, thank you so much. So you're a believer, and I'm just really curious as to how your worldview influences your care for patients, both those who are of the faith and then also those who are not. You said you had a 90% Christian population in your practice. But even the 10%, which is, I imagine, would be more relevant to many of us once we enter into, our careers. How does your Christian worldview influence your care for patients?
Now, what you're speaking about, I don't feel as a therapist, I'm called to witness to people. in psychiatry, you do a lot of analogies. I don't say, well, your ego does this and your id does that, that kind of thing. I have to use the words of the patient and things like that. But my worldview of the patient is that patient, Christian or non-Christian, is created by God. God has called me in this profession to help them. Now, if I can help, and Christians need it too, but if I can help the non-Christian have a clearer view of relationships, because we transfer to God. Any of you heard of transference? Transference is what we project on another person. I'm sitting there doing nothing, and I can be God, Jesus, or Satan. It depends on what the gestalt or whatever is going on be projected onto me. Now we do that with God because we can't see him. So all the stuff we have from our childhood or any issues we have can interfere. Like for me, my father died when I was 13 from a brain aneurysm. So I grew up always being afraid someone was going to die on me. And I transferred that onto God, expecting him to die and disappear on me. And in my head, I know that wasn't true, but I had to deal with it. So my Christian, and all my analogies and things that I quoted were often from scripture. Whatever, it's just amazing how God would lead me to certain aspects of scripture that applied to what that person was going through. And I didn't find any dichotomy between my Christian faith and my psychiatric training. True, a lot of people said, oh, you got to be Freudian. I know Freud's view on religion was quite weird. It left a lot to be decided. But even non-Christians can reveal God's truth, and it's being able to take those and see that we've gone on further with research. And God would help me with difficult patients to be able to, especially when I was frustrated, to be able to see that person was created by him too, and to help them clear away all the stuff that was weeds that were interfering with the quality of life that he intended for them. So I felt very comfortable, and I felt they very much merged together very nicely. Because
Thank you so much.
Often I would say, how can you be a Christian and a psychiatrist? Well, I'm a Christian who was called to work in psychiatry. And the first thing I have to do as a witness is to be the best psychiatrist I can be. The first witness all of you guys have is to be the best doctor, the best dentist, the best whatever that you can be, and that is your witness. It can be, so I didn't necessarily have to, and once a person got through some of their issues, they were more open to the gospel, and that was someone else who usually did that. So did that answer your question?
It really did. Thank you so much.
Glad I could help.
Thank you for this talk.
Okay. I know I get very talkative. In psychiatry, I did talk much, but in here I talk a lot. So I know you got to get on to other things. I see people disappearing, so.
Thank you so much, Cheryl.
I hope it was helpful. And
Very. Absolutely.
Now, if anybody has some questions, you can always call me or email me, and I'll be open to answer any further questions.
Okay, we'll try to get that information out there to everybody.
Okay. So
Thank you.
have fun.
Bye.
Have
Thank you
fun.
so much.
Bye-bye. Okay. Don't work too hard.